Hello, my name is Professor Tom Berry. I'm the instructor for Soc212 this term. Super excited about working with you throughout the course of the term in this class, race, class, gender. Super interesting topic. Lot to cover, a lot of ground to cover, a lot of information, perspective. You know, of course, with contemporary events, I think I've drawn a lot of attention to the need to have further discussions about racial, race, class, gender inequalities, systems of privilege, systems of domination, and just trying to unpackage it, understand it better, be able to provide a better analysis than maybe we would normally kind of come to. So the idea that the class is kind of structured where we're going to start off the course of the term with kind of exploring a little bit about sociology, just to make sure we're kind of grounded in the field of sociology, have some key ideas from sociology are being represented. If you have not taken Soc201 before for an intro class, totally fine. I think there will be, for those who have taken Soc201 before, are more familiar with the approach of sociology, more familiar with the three main theories of sociology that we'll use. And so I think that make a little bit easier transition into the class for students who have not had or who have had 201 before. But if you hadn't, totally fine as well. There's a reading that's located in the week one folder. Call Me, the three sociological perspectives. I encourage everyone to read that. Even if you've taken 201 before, it provides a good foundation for kind of theoretical perspectives and thinking in sociology. Okay, so we're gonna do, like this week, these videos. Every week I'm putting together a video to cover some main ideas and perspectives, things that are important for our class meeting. So the idea is that these videos will provide a lot of rich content, information, and then you have an assignment that goes along with that to kind of reinforce what you're kind of gaining and learning and what's being presented in these videos. And the assignment is basically a summary of three or four? Well, a few main themes. So an assignment, can't remember if it was 3 or 4. Main points, main themes, main ideas that are coming out of these particular video lectures. I don't have any predetermined, like it has to be these particular things. Part of the exercise, I think, is the value of trying to discern for yourself, like, okay, what are the main ideas that are coming through in terms of these lectures and the topic that's being presented. And then you'll submit that and turn it in every week. This first week, you can turn it in, the Sunday after the first week of the term. So before the start of week 2. In future weeks, you'll need to complete it before the class meeting, before our class meeting. This ensures that everybody has kind of like, been exposed to and is engaged in the content that we're going to be working with for the week. And it's really important that that's done before our class meeting. So it makes that class meeting more productive. We can review material, we can talk about material, we can apply material, and all those different kind of things. Okay, yeah, so let me give you just a little bit of background about myself, and then we'll kind of move into the content for the week. So I've been, I'm a sociologist. I have a background in speech communication as well as in social work. So I worked in I worked in different fields. I came into teaching full time, probably, 20 some years ago. We moved here 15 years ago. And I started teaching this particular class probably 10 or 11 years ago. It's been super valuable to me and super interesting. The times that we are living through, to see the change in terms of student awareness, engagement, and interest in the topics of understanding inequality. Probably when I first started teaching the class, there was a lot more misunderstandings about structural inequality, greater lack of awareness about ways in which systems of privilege and disadvantage happen. There was a lot of work done in class just to try to encourage a baseline of knowledge and understanding, and to work through kind of a lot of misconceptions that are learned from culture that we can sometimes adopt and repeat without sort of being more reflective of sort of what those ideas are. Students are, fast forward to, I don't know, the last 4 or 5 years, or just increasingly so over the years, students come to the class, most students come to the class much more aware of issues of inequality, much more interested in understanding them. And I think much more well-centered too, wanting to address these issues, coming from a place of trying to encourage greater equity, of trying to ensure that we're creating environments that are supportive of people in useful, powerful, meaningful, democratic ways. At the same time, being respectful. So it's like being engaged and trying to encourage discourse versus dispute. And that's, I just, when I see that, it's just like, it's amazing. A number of students I've had over the course of years, the recent years, who are not only just engaged and interested in wanting to know more, but wanting to make change, right? Make change in terms of, in ways that are productive, helpful, and useful. So hopefully you find the class very intellectually stimulating, very meaningful and purposeful in terms of, your own understanding, and also giving sort of some indication of what we can do. All right. With that said, let's kind of move into the content for today. We're going to start off with kind of an overview. Whoa, here we go. Let's start off with an overview of the 3 sociological theories and perspectives, and then move into some content from one of the articles you're going to read for this week, called The Matrix, or Intersecting Oppressions, by Patricia Hill Collins. So Audre Lorde, and this quote from her is a pretty powerful one. The true focus on revolutionary change is never merely the oppressive situations that we seek to escape, but that piece of the oppressor which is planted deep within each of us. And I think what this speaks to is that in the world that we, in any culture, in any society, that inequalities exist, and those inequalities exist in various dimensions. They could happen within education and criminal justice, the legal system. I mean, there are a lot of ways in which the inequalities may exist within that. And to maintain those inequalities requires the participation and the involvement and the support of the majority of people in society itself. Now, people in different class positions or different racial statuses, different gender, sexual orientation positions, may have different understandings of issues that are going on, or will likely have different understanding of issues that are going on. But it requires, the system of domination requires the active participation of all members in societies to maintain that. So it takes like a real social movement and social change to really start to challenge dominant cultural ways of thinking, knowing, and doing, to examine that oppressor component that exists within all of us that we've learned through being socialized within this culture, to understand that and to have greater awareness of where how we may be supporting and reinforcing systems of advantage and disadvantage without even knowing it. And so it's really trying to, I think what this quote for me is, what it's trying to indicate is that we've all sort of developed some oppressor mentality, regardless of our position, even if we're in a minority group position, that there can be oppressor sort of components that are contained within that. So this is about empowerment. And I think a lot of what we will cover, we kind of look at it through different lenses. And I always think it's important to sort of examine, like, to be critical in terms of a critical awareness of the world events, historical events, the lived experiences of different groups. And it's an empowering, the more critically aware we are, the more empowered we are to make changes in ways that are more democratic, that humanize individuals in our population, and that make the promise of our ideal culture, to make that promise more real, right? So equality of opportunity is an important American value. So let's kind of work to understand where it's not, where there's not equality of opportunity, and help to ensure that we are invested in making that happen. All right, so sociology is the systematic study of society itself. I mean, that's like the definition of sociology. So it's systematic study of society, and sociology is engaged in really drawing from history, political science, gender studies, race studies, looking at, psychology, anthropology. It's multidisciplinary in nature. It's its own academic discipline, but it draws from a broad scope of different disciplines to understand the macro level, culture, institutions, so the sort of macro level piece, all the way down to the micro level or individual and groups. So sociology is is a discipline that was founded on understanding society, systematic understanding of society. And to do that, we have to understand culture and institutions, and then understand the interrelationship between individuals, groups, that's the micro level, all the way up to the macro level of society itself and groups and institutions. So we have three main theories, and we will use these theories to kind of guide our discussion throughout the course of the term. So we'll kind of move back and forth between these theories to kind of like talk about how we could use these theories to understand kind of things that might be going on. So it's kind of review some main ideas. The column in the article is a great summary of the three theories, and there's a host of videos out, of course, out on the internet that you can access that provide a good overview of the theories. Crash Course in Sociology is a pretty good resource. Of course, Khan Academy is another useful one as well. So the first theory we'll talk about, structural functionalism, or more broadly speaking, just functionalism, has a very conservative view of the social world. And basically, this is the first theory in sociology that emerges in the 1800s, and it's Emil Durkheim there on the right, who kind of forms the ideas of the structural functionalist perspective. And what he's doing is he takes the field, a concept or a framework from the field of biology, and applies it to the social world. So we take all the different components of a biological analysis from a biological viewpoint in terms of the biological world, and apply those principles to the social world. So you kind of get this sort of, think about it as an ecosystem. Society as an ecosystem is one model to think about when we're thinking about the structural functionalist perspective. And there's some things that, to kind of consider. So from a functionalist viewpoint, societies, they seek stability, right? I mean, all organisms, they seek a sense of balance and order and stability. And they're adaptive. They adaptive to changes in the environment. This perspective is kind of a very evolutionary, biological, Darwinistic kind of view in general, kind of that kind of framework. The view is that that society is a problem-solving entity. So if there's an issue comes up, society's changing, there's a new issue coming up, that society works to solve that particular problem because it's about self-preservation, the preservation of society itself. I mean, you can think about COVID, or back up real quick, that interdependent parts, all different institutions within society are working to maintain that balance and order. Interdependent parts can include, schools and healthcare, law enforcement, family, the economy. I mean, all these parts are working together to create stability and order. You think about COVID, with COVID, right? Think about all these, it's a great example of how a change in one area affects a change in another area, all these layers of interdependency, right? So schools, kids not, for safety and security, if kids not being able to be in school, but to be having classes, remotely, the impact on family, the impact on the economy. I mean, all these different sort of, the domino effect or the interrelationships between various institutions. Another component of the functionalist perspective is that society is built on a value consensus, a general consensus. So think about it like we have Constitution, a Bill of Rights, we have major components of culture, and that operates under what, from a functionalist view, as a value consensus. It's not that everybody agrees in totality with these values, but there's a strong consensus about particular values. And Durkheim and functionalists would argue that societies are more stable when there's greater consensus regarding what those core values are. Another important components are integration, the level of involvement, the level of integration of individuals into community itself. and the degree of regulation of individuals and groups. So regulation either formal, like law enforcement institutions providing some sort of regulation, or on the outside of that, looking at it from a viewpoint of informal regulation, family, friends, people in the community. Like those are important to creating sort of regulating human behavior. So think about, I mean, a few years ago, right, Confederate flags, whether or not Confederate monuments and Confederate flags in public places. A lot of debate. A lot of communities went to, removing and placing monuments within, museums or other dedicated areas for historical relics. A lot of contention though, right? So that's the time period where that consensus is fracturing, where before there was not a questioning from majority culture and society itself. And then we moved to this place of active engagement, involvement, of trying to address this issue about what is the proper place of monuments, to the Civil War in public places and institutions. Our integration, the groups that we belong to, shape how we view that particular kind of thing, right? This particular social issue. Regulation is like, okay, well, society's values are changing, where what was viewed as acceptable before, increasingly viewed as these are symbols of racial oppression and white supremacy. Our values have shifted. Not everyone agrees, but enough of a consensus has shifted that new regulations in terms of what goes into the public square become sort of part of that. So that's kind of like, a way to apply that theory in that way. Anomie is defined as normlessness, rapid normlessness. And when we lack stability within community itself, and there's a lot of sudden and rapid change, it creates a lot of disorder. COVID-19, is one example, right? A lot of rapid social change, very destabilizing for institutions and for society itself. And then we kind of move into the sort of the ideas of like manifest and latent functions. Manifest are the intended functions of institutions, and latent functions are the unintended. So for example, with education, part of the intended function of education is to provide education resources to students to help them become powerful citizens within the world, become more economic, just sort of have skills and abilities and knowledge needed to be able to be successful in the economic sphere. Latent functions of education are providing supervision while parents are at work. There's a hidden curriculum, the things that students are learning, socialization that goes on, may not be the intended function, but it's important. The latent, the unintended can be very powerful as well. And then finally, like dysfunctions. Dysfunctions are part of all systems. And dysfunctions, if they get significant enough and they create a challenge or a threat to the social order, then society makes adjustments and changes. The view of social change from a functionalist viewpoint is slow, gradual change that tends to be focused on reform. So it's a very conservative viewpoint, and that'll come up throughout the course of the term. We'll kind of talk about it. But here's kind of some different examples of how we could sort of think from a functionalist viewpoint. We've got to think about what are our common values. And when you put the word "our" in there, we have to have a sense of shared understanding of what those values are. Right? We're never going to get complete agreement, but there has to be some examination of what values that we're representing, or creates too much. If there's too much disagreement or lack of agreement regarding what those common values are, it's hard to create a stable social order. And we'll talk about this in class when we kind of get together as well. It's like, okay, what are those common values about diversity? What are the common values that we have about equality of opportunity? How do we treat others? Where do we see dysfunctions in that? And what are the ways in which we're trying to address what some of those dysfunctions are? So you kind of see, George Floyd here, protest, Black Lives Matter, All Lives Matter, the sort of counter response. I think we're a nation in a time period that's seeking, number one, I think we're moving in terms of awareness and understanding, and our values regarding diversity and equality of opportunity and experience for people. And that shift in our values and our desires and our hopes is challenging. It's threatening to some people. And so there's a little bit of a rupture going on. Some of that rupture is just part of the process of social change. It can be very disruptive, as of course, as well. So anyway, we'll come back to that, talk about that a little bit more when we get together our class session. But that's kind of the functionalist viewpoint. Conflict viewpoint, conflict theory is just a different perspective. It's a different theory. My kind of approach in thinking about theories, it's important to know the background or the major ideas of all the theories, and then to be able to apply those theories. It's not about whether we agree or disagree with the theory. But it's about how do we apply the ideas of the theory to social issues and to situations to develop a different analysis. And then we can build evidence and decide, okay, which of the theories has the most merit in terms of its analysis, okay? So conflict theory is another macro level theory. Functionalism at macro level, looking at institutions and culture. Conflict theory the same way. Materialism, historical materialism for a Marxist perspective, and that's Karl Marx there, a Marxist or conflict theory perspective, focuses on the economic structure, which is the materialism, the materialist structure. So capitalism is a materialist structure. Capitalism creates inequalities. It's impossible to have capitalism without having social class, without having class inequalities. Capitalism is about, the extraction of resources for profit, and people are less important than the means through which people can be used, or the means that individuals are involved in generating kind of profit. So Marx was, coming out of a time period where, industrialization was going on. I mean, there's like mass movements towards cities. There's a lack of regulation of industries. There's a lot of abuses of power within institutions. And Marx was developing a model that was critiquing this emerging and developing system of capitalism. The historical part is that Marx looked at different economic systems across time, going back to when humans lived in nomadic communities and were nomadic. They're traveling around. They weren't located in one place. All the way from nomadic communities, hunting and gathering, to agricultural-based societies 7,000 years ago or so, to capitalism, to what he believed eventually the societies would move to socialist-based economies, and eventually to communist-based societies. Now, whether that happens or not, I think most academics and theorists don't see that as happening. But use this model today. We talk about neo-Marxism, new Marxism, to be able to use the foundation, the framework of Marxist thought, to be able to critique and understand society and a host of different issues. One thing to kind of make a comparison with the functionalist viewpoint is this idea of a shared consensus of values. The conflict theory perspective is understanding that society is built on it's about competition, and I need to put another word in here, coercion, that we're coerced into certain values. That it's the values that come from the ruling class. It's those values that are the ones that are supported. It's those values that get embedded in institutions and ways of life and within culture itself. So it's not about a consensus, but it's about coercion. I mean, you can think about, this is a big macro level issue, but we could look at slavery, right? So slavery, 1619 in America, the development of that slave-based economy was resources. I mean, it was built and predicated upon a model of economic advancement and achievement for those who were the property owners. The values that came out of that and the experiences that came out of that was not about a consensus from people within the community itself. It was about coercion. It was through force to make that happen. So with conflict theory, the Marxist perspective, it's sort of an examination of the haves, those of the ruling class, versus the have-nots. And it's about, there's limited resources in society itself. how do we distribute those resources? Who decides how they're distributed? And oftentimes, power comes into play. And we could apply the Marxist thought or the conflict theory thought not only to class, which is what Marx devoted to his focus mostly on class, to also examining race, gender identity, sexual orientation, and other areas of our identities. This idea of false consciousness and class consciousness is really important, that from a Marxist-based perspective, that to maintain a system of inequality requires the active participation of members of society to agree to it. And this goes back to that Lord comment or that quote at the beginning, that we have parts of that oppressor within all of us. We develop a false sense of consciousness sometimes, a false awareness of how the world operates. We believe in, for example, the ideas of the American dream. If you work hard enough, if you are principled and you do the right things, you will make it and do well financially in the world. And there's some truth to that. It's not that there's no truth to that, but that to believe that that is what determines your class position ignores a lot of structural issues that privilege some and disadvantage others. And so that idea that, well, if people don't make it, it's their own fault, is a very false conscious sort of idea. And what Marx argued is people need to become more class aware or more aware of inequalities in order to change things. So that a dominant ideology or the dominant beliefs in society tend to be those of the ruling class, and that these ideologies lead to, oftentimes the dominant ones lead to blaming the victim versus looking at the system. There's a short video here. I encourage you to go into Blackboard, go into PowerPoint that's posted in Blackboard and watch it. It's on redlining, and when mortgage companies put red lines around areas of a community and did not provide loans to predominantly African Americans who are seeking to buy or sell homes in particular areas. So that had significant impacts in terms of how communities were structured, the development of wealth, the ability to, in this case, to be restricted or to be not able to develop wealth, and sort of the long-term consequences of that. So that's an example of conflict theory in action. Vine Deloria, 1960s, I think it was late 1960s, maybe early 70s when he wrote this. Custer Died for Your Sins, looking at policies from the American government regarding Native American lands and treaties over the course of time, but looking at it from a Native American viewpoint. Who's writing history becomes an important point. Writing history from the viewpoint of the oppressor or from the viewpoint of the oppressed. And in this case, it's like conflict theory. It's really trying to work and trying to understand, and we have to understand multiple viewpoints in order to be able to get there. And here's some questions, and we can talk about these in class when we get together as well. I just put this together just to kind of demonstrate conflict theory is interested in looking at examining, we can do that objectively, examining the degree of inequality. How do we sort of account for example, that Blacks and Latinos, this is their level of wealth development compared to whites over a course of time. And like, why is it that way, right? There's a lot of structural things that are going on historically as well as contemporary society that are helping to maintain that particular inequality. And then you get issues of power, right? So if you have that kind of disparity between the top and the bottom, it lends itself to a significant power imbalance. And then those who have more power can exercise a greater voice in terms of systems. So that's the idea there. And the final one is like the third theory, a more interactional level, micro level, is symbolic interactionism. So here we're looking at language, symbols, meaning, thinking about how we develop understanding. And that's, super fascinating and interesting because it gets us into culture and history and individual groups and trying to understand our own lived experience and how we interact with the sort of symbolic world. So the Thomas theorem is a kind of a key way of thinking about symbolic interactionism, is that the Thomas theorem is if you define it as real, it's real in its consequences. So if we define something, it's how we define it, it's how we perceive something, impacts, our response to something. So you could look at it, in the article, in the Call Me article, I think he lays it out as you have the stimulus and then the response. And in between the stimulus and the response is the perception or the interpretation. So we have the objective world, right? But we don't respond to the objective world or experience as it is, but we respond to our interpretation of it. So for example, like transgender, um, looking at involvement and engagement, the place of transgender people who are transgender within the community itself, access to public restrooms, for example. There was controversy around that for a period of time. Our language system, it's like we respond to our interpretation. So the stimulus would be, looking at the individual in terms of their gender identity, their sexual orientation, different aspects of who they are. And how we see the individual and respond to the individual or the groups in which that individual belongs is not based on the properties of the individual, but rather our interpretation. And so it gets us into the social world of like, okay, what did we learn? How did we learn? How do different groups sort of approach understanding things in different ways? So, I mean, it gets us into looking at language. Language is fascinating. It gets us into looking at symbols, looking at the meaning that we assign to things and how that's being shaped by culture and by the groups that we belong to. We'll talk about this for right now, but this is sort of a real brief. You encourage you to watch that short video as well. Famous study that was an important part of the Brown versus the Board of Education Topeka back in 1954 that ended legal segregation of public facilities in the United States. So desegregation happened after 1954, and part of it was the Kenneth Clark study, a psychologist, a team, him and his wife conducted a study to demonstrate that Black kids are learning that Black is bad, that white is good, and it's having significant issues on their own identity and their opportunities in the long term down the road. So a lot of interactionist stuff going on there. All right, so I'm going to kind of try to hit some highlights here. I've been talking for a long time, but I want to provide a framework of the matrix of domination. You're going to read an article this week, one of them, Patricia Hill Collins, Intersecting Oppressions. Fascinating, valuable article. It's a little abstract. You're going to be reading it. My guess, you're going to be reading it. You're going to go like, some of it, you're going to be wondering like, what is she talking about? I don't understand what is going on. Part of it, go through that struggle in terms of your write-up. Do the best you can in terms of your understanding of the article, and we will unpackage it further when we get into class. This article provides a framework that we'll use throughout the course of the term in examining these interlocking oppressions, and we can look at systems from a system analysis, systems of oppression, systems of advantage, systems of privilege, and its relationship to systems of oppression. So it becomes a framework that we're going to use throughout the course of the term. Okay, so I'm going to walk through parts of it, and then in class we can talk in a little bit more detail. So her basic idea is that, she's trying to understand the ways in which we know, the ways that we come to develop understanding of the social world, of ourselves, of others, of society itself. And that there's been a long history of privileging scientific ways of knowing. She's not opposed to scientific ways of knowing, but her argument, the case that she's making, is that those ways of knowing are actually very limiting in terms of they provide a partial view into the world, but they lack the ability to provide a more full and more complete view of the world. And not only that, but that scientific way of thinking and knowing is a way of also oftentimes of reinforcing inequalities. It's impersonal. It lacks the imagination of trying to understand the experiences of different groups. It's trying to calculate and objectify, but not getting us to more fully appreciate and understand the ways in which different groups experience the world. So this second point, dominant ideals, they privilege the empirical, the objective, that what we sort of see as the rational objective or the objective ways of knowing, statistics. surveys, the measuring things, that empirical way of knowing. And that neglects the interpretive, the ways in which we come to know, the ways that we experience, the ways that people interpret the world. So it neglects that particular component, which is really powerful. And then she provides in the article, provides this quote from Karl Marx, that it's not our consciousness that determines our being, but rather our being that determines our consciousness. So basically that's trying to get out there is that it's not the ways that we think that determine us, but rather it's our social location that starts to determine the ways that we think. So if I'm a member of I'm a white cisgender male, middle income, educated, I mean, all those different sort of formally educated in terms of, in terms of college. My social being, my location is shaping my consciousness, my ways of thinking and knowing. To go back to that false consciousness thing, right? So unless we are engaged in trying to understand how our social location is influencing the ways that we think and know, we may be involved in reproducing systems of advantage and disadvantage without even knowing it, because we are just engaged in a system without being more critically aware of our own position and the experience of others. And then Marx has this idea that the ideas of the ruling class are really the dominant ideas of society itself. Patricia Hill Collins argues for and advocates for that we need to engage in sort of understanding the subjective experience, the interpretive experience, to engage in dialogue versus debate, to be able to understand, to critique, to be able to do that in ways that challenge each other, but that we can advance thought and idea by engaging in dialogue. And this idea that, all knowledge, even things that seem really objective, contain value positions and value positions within that. And it's being aware of how something that's empirical, that's objective, that we say is kind of value neutral, that they contain values, and understand that and unpackage that becomes really important. And I'm thinking right now, looking at criminal justice and looking at data, how we gather data in terms of criminal justice, it's trying to objectively understand, things about demographics of who's incarcerated, for example, the background of individuals who are incarcerated, their racial background, the individual's gender, different ways in which we're trying to categorize and understand basically who's incarcerated, who's involved in the criminal justice system. Those are all objective ways of knowing, but there's value positions that are embedded within collecting that particular data. There's assumptions that are being made. There's things that are being reinforced when we're thinking about that. We're not looking at the intersection, for example. We see the data on racial distribution of those who are in prison for violent crime. We're not looking at the intersectionality, for example, between race and class. So we start to develop this sort of perception that we associate the meaning of it's individuals in a particular racial group will have the highest rate of violent crime. It's like, okay, let's break that down a little bit. Race is a factor, but race takes place within a context. And that context could be shaped by social location, by social class position. And there's values that are embedded in the way that research is conducted, the way that research is presented. And it may not be necessarily consciously being communicated in certain ways, but it's there, it's back there. Let's see, yeah, okay. So epistemology is ways of knowing. Epistemology, an epistemological approach is a systematic way of thinking about how do we come to know what we know. And she's advocating for generating more subjective ways of knowing. The arts and the humanities, reading literature from the viewpoints of others, people who are other than our own. I picked up this book, read it over break. It's been really interesting. It's called Billionaire Wilderness. It's in Teton County in Wyoming is the county with the greatest disparity between the wealthy and and the poor, or just income stratification in that county, and wealth stratification is the highest of anywhere in the United States in terms of county level. And it's super fascinating. It's an examination. What the author is, he's a Yale sociologist, and he interviews 120 some members of the ultra wealthy, which is just fascinating in itself to get access to and to develop relations and interview 120 people who are pretty private in terms of who they are. And, it's about trying to understand how do the ultra wealthy think? He's interested in how do they think about the community that they live in? What's the ways in which they think about, their wealth that they bring into that community. And at the same time, there's all kinds of challenges with affordable housing and other issues of inequalities that are going on in the community. How do they kind of try to integrate themselves into the community? So it's a different way of knowing. He's providing some data points, but it's more of this more subjective way of knowing. And Patricia Hill Collins is calling for for us to be engaged in a more subjective way of knowing, that we oftentimes deprivilege that, and she's advocating that we privilege that. In part, I think that if we can know something on a more subjective level, then we can empathize and understand, and we personalize and we humanize more than only looking at data points and empirical information. And so that's an important part of understanding other groups and experiences, and understanding from their viewpoint and perspective, hearing their voice come through in movies and film and literature, and in more subjective ways of knowing. All right, we'll kind of come to that maybe in class, and then kind of just provide a framework and what the matrix of domination is looking at. Sort of, it's a matrix, so interrelationships, and looking at how things are interrelated that creates sort of a system of domination. It's different than a difference model. What a difference model is basically saying you have one group here, and identifying the differences between the two, that one group, the majority versus minority. It's like, okay, that's keeping them separate. The additive model is saying, okay, they're looking at multiple levels of inequalities or privilege. So class is one part of the model. Race is another part, gender is another part, gender identity is another part. So it's like adding up these different levels. So adding up to come up with, okay, how privileged is a person, or how disadvantaged is a person. So those models there's some value in that, but there's a lot of limitations to that. So the matrix model is trying to integrate, it's a more integrative model of looking at the interrelationships between the macro level, the micro level, and the group experience. So it's an analytical framework that's trying to understand systematic way of thinking about privilege and domination, systems of privilege and domination within a historical context, within a cultural context, and looking at it from the macro level to the micro level. And then she identifies basically 4 different interdependent domains of power. The structural, let's think about as institutions. The disciplinary, which she calls the disciplinary, the sort of the social control aspects of society. So it could be a little bit of the structural, but it's focused on trying to understand where are regulations coming from the informal groups, individuals, family, community, all the way to the formal institutions, criminal justice system, other ways in which social control is operating. So interested in, this matrix of domination, looking at institutions, looking at the ways in which things are being regulated, the interpretive, the ways we come to know, and then the interpersonal, the sort of interactive, the ways in which our relation building between different groups, our membership to different groups, and how that's shaping how we know and understand. So it's kind of looking at this sort of complex, this model that allows us to more effectively understand the subjective experiences of different groups, understanding all the way from the macro level of the structural and the disciplinary areas, all the way down to the group and the individual, from the interpretive and interpersonal. And we need to do all that in order to understand kind of systems of inequality and systems of privilege and disadvantage. Okay, that's kind of like the framework. It's a lot of kind of heady theoretical stuff just to kind of get us started. Looking forward to our class meeting. If you have any questions, let me know. Yeah, just drop me an email. If you ever want to set up a Zoom meeting, more than happy to do that as well. Yeah, we'll see you. I'll see you at class on Thursday. The Zoom link is in Blackboard. Yeah, on the left-hand side, you'll see Zoom meeting, and then it has the password, which is John Lennon, capital J, capital L, no space in between. And just click on the link. Click on the link Zoom meeting. It'll take you to the web page, and then just type in the password, and that'll get you to the class. All right, welcome to class. See you on Thursday.